In our parsha, at the end of the story of the mun, the Torah concludes via oimer. Oimer is the measurement of the mun that was being mentioned the whole time throughout the mun. Keeps on saying that it was an oimer. The Torah says an oimer asiris oifo. This oimer is 1/10 of an ephah. The question is, why is the Torah telling us the measure of the oimer only at the end, very end of the parsha of the mun? After the Torah told us already all the details and aspects of the mun, all the way to the very end, where the pasuk says that the Yidden ate the mun for 40 years until they come into a settled land. Now the Torah is telling us the measure of the mun. Seemingly, the Torah should have said this at the very first time that this oimer, this measure of the oimer, is being mentioned by mun. The Bechaya, that's Rabbeinu Bechaya, explains that the whole parsha was explaining the idea of the mun. After we finished discussing the aspects of the mun, we now need to say at the end how much actually was the shear, what the measurement of the mun was. But the question is, why is the measurement of the mun a separate issue, not a detail of all the aspects of the mun, telling us the story of the mun? If the Torah is just trying to tell us that with the words asiris ha'efa, exactly how much this measurement of the oimer was, which the pasuk had mentioned earlier, and we don't know what that is, so for that reason itself, this measurement should have said earlier in the psukim, because the quantity of the amount is not a side point of the mun. This is very important to understand the whole story, to understand what was going on in the mun. We know that the mun came down as a result of the complaints of the Yidden that you took us out, they said, to this midbar to kill this whole congregation in famine, in hunger. Hashem responds to that. I heard the complaints of the Bnei Yisrael. And therefore, as the Torah continues, this is what Hashem commanded. You should each collect according to your food, the needs of your food, 1 oimer per each person, according to the amounts of people you have. And they measured the oimer, and anybody that took more didn't end up with more. Anyone that took less didn't end up with less. Every person took according to the food that they were supposed to take. So obviously, it's very relevant in these psukim to know what is this shear, what is this measurement of the needs that they took for their food, for each person, to be able to have the food to be satisfied for that particular day, and in such a way that more than that was not necessary, and that's why if anyone took more, they didn't end up with more. Less than that wouldn't have been enough, and that's why if anyone took less, they didn't end up having less. Seemingly, this itself tells us that this pasuk v'omer asiris ha'efahu is not just telling us the exact measurement of the omer of the omer month for each person, which was already said earlier on, but rather with this shear, the Torah is clearly coming to add some other aspect in regards to the mun, which is not connected with the whole parsha of the mun itself and the way it came down throughout the 40 years in the midbar. But somehow this point is relevant after the Torah tells us already about the Yidden are finishing to eat the mun, and that the Yidden ate the mun for 40 years, all the way until they come to a settled land, to the edge of Eretz Canaan. Now the Torah is telling us something that's going to be relevant now, that the oimer is 1/10 of an ephah. In order to explain this, says the Rebbe, we're going to understand it by first introducing another thing that needs clarification in regards to this whole thing that the pasuk says that each person should take 1 oimer per each person, according to the amount of people in the families, etc. So for each person, they gathered 1 oimer. And the question is, in the nature of people, obviously there are major differences, especially a difference between a small child and an adult, in regards to the quantity of food that's going to cause that the person should be full, should be satisfied. How is it possible that the very same measurement should be for a little child and for an adult, especially an adult whose body is much larger than other adults? Now, even though it's true the whole way how the mun came down with all of its details was all in a very miraculous way, and so too in regards to eating the mun, that they were able to taste so many different flavors, so many different tastes in it, and that there was no waste from the food as a result of it, and so on. And therefore, it shouldn't be surprising that the amount of mun, the measure of the mun, should also be enough to satisfy or to feed each person according to his needs. Nevertheless, says the Rebbe, we don't find clearly that the Razal should emphasize that this was one of the miracles of the mun, that there was exactly the same amount satisfied each person. Similar to what the Gemara does say in regards to other inyanim of the mun. Even things that the pasuk specifically tells us anyways. As Rashi says in regards to Hamarbe v'Hamamit, someone that took more, someone that took less, that both of them ended up with exactly the same Omer L'Gul Goylos. And Rashi brings V'zeu Nes Gadol. In other words, we emphasize this was a miracle that happened, even though the Torah tells it us anyways. And somehow this aspect that they all had the same amount, and this satisfied all of them in the same way, the Gemara doesn't mention this. Razal don't say this. So we must say that the fact that the oimer was enough, both for someone very small as well as for someone very large, very big, wasn't a miracle or an additional miracle to the man, but somehow this is connected to the very essence, to the very definition of what the man, the nature of the man is on its own. To explain. The sugya in the Gemara, in Masechta Yuma in regards to the man, is actually coming in the middle of the halachos regarding the fasting of Yom Kippur. And there in the Gemara is discussing the amount of food that one would be chayav for, one would get punished for by eating on Yom Kippur. And the Gemara speaks over there and says something very similar to this idea, this chidush that we find by the man. The amount that one would be obligated for eating on Yom Kippur is called kakoi seves, which is the amount, the volume of a date. The Gemara says the reason for this is because the Chachamim had a tradition that with this amount, the volume of a date, that would ease the mind of a person. Less than that, a person would not calm down, a person's mind would not be set at ease if he had food less than that. The Gemara there discusses again that there's a difference seemingly should be a difference between larger people and smaller people. So the Gemara continues and says, nevertheless, for most people, that amount, that would sort of calm them down or ease their mind a lot. For someone like Oig Melech HaBashan, it would just put his mind to ease a little bit. And here again, seemingly, is the same question. What's the explanation? What is the answer? You can ask exactly the same question again. If the amount of a kaisevis, of the volume of a date, would ease the mind, would calm down someone like Oig Melech HaBashan, so then the amount that should sort of ease the hunger, the mind of a regular person should obviously be a much smaller shear than that kaisevis. And if for everyone a kaisevis is enough to satisfy them, then how could you say that same shear, that same measurement will be enough to settle the mind of someone like Oig Melech HaBashan? This itself tells us, the Rebbe, that the shear of a kaisevis, which eases the mind of a person, is a kind of shear that's not really measurable based on the size of the body. And the Rebbe gives an example. The Rebbe says this is similar to that which is known. There's a shaklavatariya, there's a discussion in regards to measurements in halachos and the dinim of the Torah. The way we understand a certain measurement could be in two ways. One is what's called a shear mitztarif, that when we speak about a certain measure, it's all cumulative. In other words, we have one little bit, another little bit, another little bit, till finally we have this particular shear. Or what's called a shear atzmi, which we might translate as an inherent shear. In other words, it's a matter of a qualitative thing that once you have this amount, less than that is going to be nothing, as the Rebbe is going to be able to explain. It's not just you have a whole bunch of little bits till you get to this point. This shear is just an essential or an inherent shear. As the Ragachever explains in regards to a number of dinim. Starting with a general machloikas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, in regards to the concept of chatzi shear, whether this is osur min haTorah. In other words, like this, we know many things that a person will be chayav, he'll be obligated, he'll be punished if he has a certain measure of a certain thing. The question is, there's a machloikas over between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, whether if a person had less than that measure, whether min haTorah, whether midoiraisa, is it osur, or it's not even a problem if you have less than half. In other words, half of the share, less than the full amount. The way the Ragachover explains it is it's really a machloikas in the whole definition of how we understand the measure of a isur. According to Rabbi Yochanan, who says that even a half a measure is going to be osur min haTorah, that's because the way he understands the idea of shiurim is when Torah says you're not allowed to have a certain amount, this is what's called a shear mitztaref, a cumulative shear. In other words, it consists of a whole bunch of little parts which all come together to the full measure. And therefore, each little bit is also problematic. But when are you going to be punished? When it all comes together. And therefore, even less than the amount is still the idea that Isur still applies to it. It's only that the punishment for the Isur is only going to come when you have all of these little bits and pieces that came together. So that's called Shir Mitztaref. On the other hand, Reish Lakish, who says that Chatzi Shir is not Asur Min HaTorah, because he's of the opinion that the Shir of the Isur is what's called a Shir Atzmi, an inherent Shir. In other words, the isur is only when you have this amount. Less than that is nothing. So if it's less than the shiur, it's not considered isur at all. It's not anything at all. In other words, the whole isur of the Torah didn't apply to it yet. The Torah only made asur whatever the particular shiur in that isur is. So to explain it a little bit more and how it's all going to be tied into our case. So the Rebbe starts off by saying that in the chayis hanefesh, in the vitality, the life force that comes from the nefesh, from the soul into the body, there's generally two aspects. There's something called chayis klali, a general life force, which gives life to the whole body equally. In this life force, there's no difference between the way it's giving life to the head and the way it's giving life to other parts of the body. In all of them, the life, vitality is exactly the same. That means to say the fact that the person is alive, he's a chai, he's alive, is exactly the same in every part of the body. There's no difference between one part of the body that it's alive to another part of the body. And just like it's within one body, that there's no difference as far as this general chayas between one part, between the brain and the head, or the heel and the foot, because this chayas klali, this general chayas, is not measured, it's not limited according to the parts of the body which he is giving life to. So too, there's going to be no difference between this general chayas, the way it's in one body, and the way it's in another body. By every single person, this general nefesh, this general chayas, is in exactly the same way. In other words, the nefesh, the life force, this general life force, the soul of a little child could give life to the body of someone like Oig Melech HaBasham. Then we have what's called the chayis prati, the individual life force, the individual vitality, which is measured according to the characteristic of each body and according to each part of the body. Every single organ, every single part of the body, the energy inside of it is going to be fitting to the specific characteristics, to the makeup, to the chemistry of that particular part of the body. So in the head, which is a more refined, a more a delicate part of the body, so the individual chayis there is going to shine in a much greater way than in other parts of the body. And so to each and every part of the body according to its own makeup, according to its own characteristic. In this chayis, there's also going to be differences between one person, one body, and another. So this is these two types of chayis. How does the chayis connect with the guf? So we know that the attachment of the nefesh, of the soul, and the chayis coming from the soul with the body is accomplished through food, as it's known. So therefore, here too, there's two types of eating, or two types of measures, two types of shiurim within eating. There is a certain shiur, a certain measurement of eating, which is connected with the general connection of the soul to the body, that he's alive. This is what's causing that this body should be alive. And since this idea, the fact that the body is alive, is not made up of details, so therefore it's understood that the food that's going to accomplish this connection is also not made up of what we call before a shiur mitztarif. It's not made up of a whole bunch of little parts till you come to finally this measure. But rather, it's what we called before the shiur atzmi. There's a certain inherent amount, a certain inherent measurement that's needed to keep the soul in the body. And therefore, in the shiur of this food, there's not going to be a difference between one guf, one body, and the other. And that's the shiur the Chachamim was speaking about in Yom Kippur. This Kosev is the volume of a date, which the Chachamim said, with this, they had a tradition that this amount sort of eases the mind of the person, which is the opposite of inui, feeling afflicted and full of pain, etc. And this would help every single person in the whole world, even someone like Oig Melech HaBasham. This is what we call a shiur atzmi, that inherent shiur, like the chayas of the nefesh itself, this general chayas that doesn't get divided according to different people or different aspects within the person. Then we have the shiur of food, which is connected with the chayis prati, that individual vitality, which is measured according to one's body and according to the details and the needs of each body, specifically within the different parts, in a way that the bigger the body is, obviously, the bigger the amount of food that's going to be needed for this individual chayis to come down. This shiur achila, that's what we call a shiur mitztarif. This is a cumulative shiur, because since this chayis of the nefesh consists of lots of details of each and every part of the body, so it's understood that also when we come to the measure of the food, which is connected to this chayis, it's also the food. The measurement of the food is also going to be made up of a whole bunch of details. Each detail of this shiur is going to be adding a little bit more chayis, a little bit more energy, and is going to be measured to each person according to the size of his body, or to that particular part of the body, and in according to this particular chayis of the nefesh with all of its details. Based on all of this, says the Rebbe, we can now explain in regards to the mun. The difference between the two expressions and the two shiurim, essentially, that say by the man, on the one hand it says an oimer, and then by the end it says asiri so'efa. So the words asiri so'efa emphasize that this is a part of a bigger measurement. There's an ephah, and here now we're speaking about a tenth of an ephah. As Rashi explains, how an ephah is 3 sa'ah, and how a tenth of an ephah would be the amount of 43 and a fifth eggs, the volume of that. Whereas the word oimer, just saying a plain word oimer, is not emphasizing a certain shear that's being made up of other details. We're not saying the oimer is these 43 and a fifth eggs, etc. It's one measurement, it's an oimer. Says the Rebbe, this is why in the whole parsha of the Mon, the Torah keeps on using the word oimer lagulgoilas. Vayomoidu boimer, they measured an oimer, etc. It's only at the very end, almost after the whole parsha, the pasuk specifies the shear and says that the oimer is a tenth of an ephah, because in the parsha of the Mon is mainly, what's mainly relevant and what it's mainly discussing is the aspect of the oimer, the measurement of the oimer, not as it is a cumulative shear, but rather the shear atzmi, this inherent shear, which does not get divided in quality. In other words, the quality is one nekuda, it's one idea, which is not really split into parts, not divisible. Why is that? Because the main aspect of the Mon is to achieve and to bring about that connection of the essence of the chayis, that general chayis with the body, similar to what we said about the koseves before. The only thing is, the chiddush, the novelty, the wonder of the Mon consisted of that although that this was a food that also achieved the other aspect, it also helped the individual chayis also connect with the guf, but nevertheless it was in a way that even that came as a result of and as part of the general chayis being fed into the body, which comes through the sheer atzmi, through that inherent aspect of the mon, which is called the oimer. As we'll soon see why that is. It's only at the very end of the parsha, the pasuk tells us this other detail as well, that the oimer is a tenth of an ephah, because the Torah wants to say and wants to add that the mon also has in itself also this other aspect, this cumulative shear mitztaref. And, says the Rebbe, the reason for this is because this is something that's not so much important or relevant to the actual eating of the mun throughout the 40 years. This is specifically relevant at the very end, after this period, when they're coming to Eretz Yisrael, as we'll see a little bit later. The Rebbe says it's known that the mun was not only a physical food to satisfy the hunger of the body and to be able to make it a receptacle to be able to receive the vitality of the nefesh. The Rebbe says if it would only be about physical food, the Eibishter Hashem could have shown the same kind of, maybe even a smaller miracle, to feed the Yidden in the Midbar by giving them ordinary bread, lechem in haaretz. The man was also a spiritual food. As the Gemara says on the pasuk, lechem abirim ochal ish, the Gemara says that the man was a food that the Malachi Hasharis eat. In other words, the man for the Yidden wasn't only to feed their physical bodies, but it was also a sustenance for their neshama, spiritual food. In other words, connecting the neshama to its source that gives it life. Meaning to connect the neshama with Hashem. Now, just like we spoke about these two differences of the vitality of the guf, getting its chayis from the nefesh hachiyunis, from the vivifying soul, and the food that's connected with the chayis, where we said this is the general chayis and the individual chayis, and therefore two aspects within the food. Similarly is true in regards to the chayis of the neshama itself, of the nefesh or the kis of the yid. That we also have two aspects. We have that essential nekuda, the point of chayis, vitality of the neshama, which is known as the nekudas hayaz, the pintel yid, which exists by each and every yid equally. And then we have what's called the hispashtas hachayis, the way the chayis spreads out, extends itself, the more revealed aspects and faculties of the neshama, in which there are many, many different levels. And this is the reason why the oimer lagulgoilas, the spiritual food, this is why we say that it was mainly a sheer atzmi, it was mainly this inherent sheer, or in other words, this essential aspect, which is equal by all Eden. And as it's emphasized in the parsha of the man, as we said, we keep on saying Omer, Omer the whole time. Why is that? Why is this the most relevant one over here? It's known by Yetzias Mitzrayim was the time of the birth of Am Yisrael. And throughout the 40 years of the Midbar, the Yidden were generally like a little child whose needs are all supported by and given to by his mother or his father. Or you could even say even like an adult that's still being supported by his father. So this is the way the Yidden were in the Midbar. Like a little child, Hashem is giving them all their needs. Food, water, clothes, etc. As the Pasuk says, Kasha Yisa Oymenes Ayonet, like a nurse carrying the little suckling, the little baby. And just like by a little baby, by a little child, the first years right after it's born, you don't see so much, really, the division of chayes, the division of faculties in the different parts of the body. In other words, you're not seeing so much, it's not emphasized yet his faculties, the intellect of the head, the feelings of the heart. What's mainly noticeable is the general chayes, the fact that he's alive, and this is in the whole body equally. And similarly with his food, the food that he's getting is basically the same food that he gets, that he nurses from his mother. It's prepared food, and furthermore, it actually has all the parts of the food, and it also contains, similar to the man, like all the tastes. In a similar way, that was the idea of the Yidden in this period, the 40 years of the Midbar, after the birth of Am Yisrael. Their spiritual food, through the physical food, the man. But the spiritual thing that was being achieved over here was mainly what we call, again, this shir atzmi, this inherent shir of the Omer Lagolgolos, which is connected again to the chayis of the etzem neshama, to the essence of the neshama, the essential bond between the Yid and Hashem, which is higher than the division of various different levels by Yidden. We'll sometimes divide Yidden that there's some like the Rosh, some like the Regel, but here we're going to something deeper than that, beyond that, where there are no differences. So it's the same food throughout the 40 years, and they had all the tastes in it. Based on this, says the Rebbe, we could also explain some other aspects that we find regarding the mun. The pasuk says, we quoted this before, they measured bo'omer, and someone that took more didn't end up with more, someone that took less didn't end up with less. Everyone remained with that omer lagulgoilus, regardless if you took more or less. And the question is, the reason why someone may have taken more mun and another person may have taken less, simply, says the Rebbe, the reason would be for someone to take more of mun, which is lechem in hashamayim, that's telling us that clearly the mun is very, very precious to him. Someone that's taking less, obviously he doesn't feel how precious and special the mun is. In fact, the Mechilta says, gives an example of who might be taking more. The Mechilta says, Nachshon ben Aminadov would go out and collect more. A poor person amongst the Yidden would go out and collect less. Why is Nachshon collecting more? What does it mean a poor person is collecting less? So the Rebbe explains in a very interesting way. The Rebbe says the fact that Nachshon ben Aminadov might want to collect more is not because of the physical aspect of the month, the physical food aspect of it. It's because, as we said before, this is a spiritual food. This is the food of the Malachim. And so too, and that's why he wants to take more of it. And so too, on the other hand, when we speak about a poor Yid, what it's mainly referring to is someone that's spiritually poor. As it says, in Ani Ela Badas, poor really means someone in his mind he's poor. In other words, spiritually he's poor. To him, the mun is not so precious when knowing that it's a spiritual food, and therefore he's taking less. And yet, what do we say? When they come to measure it, everyone ends up with the same exact amount, that omer. Furthermore, even the Yidden that didn't listen to Moshe. Moshe told them not to leave over, and there were some Yidden that left over till the morning. They didn't obey the mitzvahs that were connected to the mun. In fact, some of them went out even on Shabbos to collect when they were told not to. And yet we don't find that they should be missing in that omer. Even they got the full omer lagulgoilus. So the Rebbe says this seems to be very surprising and wondrous. If the miracle would have been in a way that Hashem would give them lechem and aretz, in other words, more of a natural bread, we would be able to say that since, based on nature, we don't really see so much of a difference between one Yid and another, so therefore, both get the same amount. Whether you take more or less, they both get the same amount. But if we're speaking about a spiritual food, lechem and hashamayim, which is completely spiritual and miraculous, and since Baruch Niyis is clearly noticeable differences between Yidden, so seemingly there should have been a difference in the measure of the mun as well, that each one should get the measure according to his personal spiritual level. And it ends up being exactly the opposite, a tremendous miracle that Hashem does, that even someone that wants to take much more because he appreciates the mun so much, like Nachshon, yet he gets less. And the person that took less, the ani badas, he has a miracle that it's increasing, he's getting more. And eventually they all end up with exact same oimer lagolgoilas. But based on what we explained, it's understood. Since the eating in the midbar throughout these 40 years was mainly, as we said, we called it the shir atzmi, this idea that's connected with a pintel yid, with the nekudas hayadus, which the nekudas hayadus, the pintel yid, is always complete by every single Jew. As the Alter Rebbe says that even b'shas achet, even when a yid is doing an aveira, the neshama always remains faithful to Hashem. So too, this mozin min hashemayim, this food from heaven, which is connected to this essential connection of a yid to the Eibishter, there's no differences in it. Every single yid gets exactly the same amount. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand why the other aspect of the mun, the oimer asiris ha'efu, that it's a tenth of efa, which said mainly represents that the mun also has this cumulative share. Why this says only at the very end, after the whole parsha, after the pasuk even says that the Yidden ate the mun till they came to a settled land, to Eretz Yisrael. Says the Rebbe, just like by food, both spiritual and physical, there are these two categories of food and these two measurements within the food, which we call the shir atzmi, this inherent or essential share, and the shir mitzvah, this cumulative share, in accordance to these two levels of the vitality coming from the nefesh. Again, whether the general chayas, connecting the general chayas, the person that's alive, to the body, or the individual, so too within the man, the food of Klal Yisrael at the time of their birth and becoming a nation to Hashem. Here too, there is these two aspects, the shir atzmi and the shir mitzvah. There's the idea of the oimer lagolgoylet, that simple oimer as we said before, and the asiris haifa. The difference between these two, however, is while they're in the midbar during the time of their birth, as we said, the main food is from the shir atzmi, from this essential aspect of the man. As we said, it's mainly building or connecting their essence to Hashem. But now as they're coming into Eretz Yisrael, into Eretz Neshavas, into the settled land, where now their avodah is going to be connected not with the midbar, it's about settling the land. We have to now start involving our individual faculties, our individual talents, etc. Now the mun, as it says, they used the mun that they had all the way until the 16th day of Nisan, or there's even an opinion of Mechilta that they ate the mun for 14 years after Moshe passes away, the 7 years that they conquered Eretz Yisrael and the 7 years that divided Eretz Yisrael. So in this period of time, now the mun is mainly the shir mitztaref aspect. In other words, now it's a food not so much was just connected with the essential chayus of the neshama, just to strengthen the simple pure faith of the neshama that was happening earlier. Now it's more going to be connected to the individual avodah, how it's connected to going into Eretz Yisrael and settling in Eretz Yisrael. Says the Rebbe, from all of this we have a hayrah to each and every one. Torah, as we know, is called lechem. The two aspects of lechem, of the bread in Torah, the lechem in Hashemayim, the bread of heaven, and lechem in Haaretz. Chazal explain refers to nigla the Torah, the revealed part of Torah, and pnimiyas Torah. So one may think, seemingly, if we're dealing with a yid, which was, so to speak, just born spiritually, he's only now starting to become closer to Yiddishkeit. You would think it would be enough to give him, in the meantime, just lechem in Haaretz, the bread from the ground, meaning nigla the Torah. Or even if you want to give him the bread of heaven, pnimiyas Torah, but maybe he's not deserving it at full shear of lechem and hashemayim. Maybe we'll just give him a small quantity of pnimiyas Torah. And needless to say, if we're speaking about a person that's not even becoming close to Yiddishkeit yet, and furthermore, it's someone that may even end up denigrating the mun, the lechem and hashemayim, that we're going to give him. So certainly it's not worth it to give him in the meantime lechem and hashemayim pnimiyas Torah, and certainly not to give him a full measure of it. So here we have the hayrah from the parsha of the mun, that it needs to be given to each individual, regardless of whatever situation he is, even someone that in the meantime is still over Rachmana litzlan on the commands of Hashem. And the Rebbe takes it a step further and actually turns it the other way around. Says the Rebbe Yeshloimar that other parts of Torah, the parts of Torah that are more connected to the revealed parts of the neshama, there sometimes we might consider, and to know clearly the person's situation, whether that person is already a shayach to this aspect, this detail, whether he is already a proper keli to receive a certain aspect of Torah. But when about lechem and hashamayim, pnimiyas Torah, these are the inyanim that's connected to the very nekudas hayadus, the pintel yid of the yid, the very essence of the yid. In other words, these are the things that are connected to the very foundations of Torah, like emunas Hashem and the oneness of Hashem and the other principles of Yiddishkeit, as the Rambam enumerates in his Yud Gimel Ikrim. So here the Torah paskins that every single Yid is shaykh to this, and is shaykh to that shir atzmi, to that inherent, essential shir, that omer lagulgoylas. From the cotton shabaktanim, from the smallest person spiritually, till the gadol shabakdoilim. Because this is connected to the very essence of what a Yid is all about. As the Rambam actually writes, after the Yud Gimel Ikrim, he says that when a person believes in these Yesodis and these foundations, with this his Emunah becomes clear, and he clarified his Emunah, and now he's part of Yisrael. In other words, clarifying this Emunah in all of these Yesodis properly, that happens through learning Pnimiyas HaTorah as it came down and was revealed, Ba'avonah, Ba'asog, in a way of understanding. And every single Yid could receive this, and therefore every single Yid has the ability, and therefore we must give it to him. The Rebbe concludes and says, Yud Shvat is the Yom Elula, as we know of the Friedrich Rebbe. And this falls in a number of years, like this year, in the week of Parshas Beshalach. From this we understand that all of the Friedrich Rebbe's Maisov, Teirosoi, V'Avodosoi, all of a connection are hinted in this Parsha. So we see that one of the main avoidance of the Baal Elul of the Friedrich Rebbe was Yafutzu Ma'Neisecha Chutza. What are these three aspects of Yafutzu Ma'Neisecha Chutza, spreading the well springs to the outside, all ties into what we're talking about? Seemingly, if we're speaking about a Yid that's in Chutza, very far away, you might think that for such a Yid it's enough if we give him water. We are giving him water, we're giving him, but that comes from a nar, from a river, which comes from the Mayan, from the wellspring. You don't have to bring him the actual wellspring itself. So here we have this clear hero, the very mayonis itself, the very wellsprings themselves. We need to bring all the way to the chutzah, all the way to the person that's the most distant. And furthermore, it's not only enough to give him little drops of this wellspring, but again, it has to be this shir shalim, this full amount, which is the idea of yafutzu hafatzu. We have to give him the proper amount. And as said before, we give every person the omer lagolgoylas of lechem and hashamayim, till every person feels also how it's so geschmack, it's so sweet, as the pasuk says, "Ta'amoik it's apiches bedvashtis," like pastries fried in honey. That every person feels that how you can have the greatest pleasure out of this, and through going in the paths that the Friedrich Rebbe had shown us forever, we hasten the promise of Malka Mashiach in the chamber of Mashiach. That through Hafatzas HaMayonis, by spreading the wellsprings of Hashem Tov Chutzah, Ka'asi Mar Mashiach will come, b'meir of Yameinu Mamash.